My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, they swear skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping any more the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
What, they don't want to listen to you?
No, they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They're just like, oh, here we go, Mark. Off again with your...
Mark being Mark again.
Yeah. So, that's the thing about podcasts is when you're on the air, and it's like therapy, If I can't talk to my family about this stuff, I'll talk to you, Matt, and all our listeners.
You'll just start your whole podcast.
Yeah. So who are we talking about today, Matt?
They think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
What is up, my fine friends, family, folks, and lovers of the other world, interdimension, multidimensional, all things esoteric and strange? It's your boy, Mark Palmer, from the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, presenting to you a Swapcast that I did with the Deep Share podcast. That's my man Andy Rouse, a little further north from where I'm at. I gotta apologize if you got this episode early. I downloaded it from Andy's feed, and I'm almost certain that this is not his fault. It's the podcast host he uses. But there were 4 dynamic ads inserted on the original audio file that I uploaded. So if you listened to that by accident, probably didn't if you're listening to this, but just know that the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast has made the decision not to take advertisers of any kind ever. So this is a value for value podcast. Show some love on Patreon and you'll never get an ad when you listen to this show. And to make up for the fact that there was an ad on the show for a couple of you listeners, I'm going to include a Patreon-only episode in the RSS feed this week. Just for you guys, a gift. Happy Labor Day. All right? Enjoy some exclusive content thrown out for free. And also enjoy this Deep Share podcast with my man Andy Rouse. It was a lot of fun. Oh, he just texted me. Look at that. All right, folks. Enjoy.
Hey there, listener. Welcome to the Deep Share podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rouse, and for the last couple of decades, I've slowly been opening my eyes to a very different world than the one I grew up hearing about. And the more conversations I have with interesting people, the more mystifying this world becomes. So without further ado, let's get deep.
There's a science to celebrate Demon Blitz now! After Butt Baby, come on!
There is rebellion in the wind. It will be crushed.
Everything I've said is true. It's real.
Dinosaur fossils? I'll have to put those here to test our faith.
A damn lie. I saw them with my own eye.
Did IQ just drop sharply while I was away?
We did illusions, man. None of it is true.
I'm not insane.
This is mass madness, you maniac. In God's name, you people are the real thing. We are the illusion.
All right, so welcome back to the Deep Share. I'm here with Mark Steeves, the man, the myth, the legend, the man behind Alt Media United, and My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. How's it going, Mark? Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me, bro. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hell yeah, man. We've been looking forward to talking for a while. Life gets in the way, though,
Yeah, no, I've been on the synchro mystic exploration of the ever expanding now, as we've been calling it, so yeah, trying to live moment by moment has made, scheduling things a little weird, but that's part of learning about the 13 moon cycle and really getting into tune with like the harmony. So that's kind of where my focus has been lately, is as much as life does get in the way, amidst all that, it's been fun.
So this 13 moon thing, go into that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what's different about how life is now when you're trying to do it like that.
Well, it started for me with this book called Time and the Technosphere, and kind of like we were talking about before we hit record here, I love going to bookstores, used bookstores, and I happen to be in Indianapolis where they have a chain of bookstores called like Books a Million or something like that. Half Price Books is what it's called. There we go. And I found this book, used, Time and the Technosphere by Jose Arguelles, and I started reading it on the Patreon because I thought it was interesting. And also my buddy Alex Stein and Alex Stein from the Conspiracy Castle, we're like, this is the 20th anniversary of 9/11 coming up, actually in a week or two from now. So we wanted to plan interviews for this 9/11 kind of marathon, maybe even a book potentially that Alex is going to put together. Wow. So this is all happening, and I'm like, all right, I want to participate in this. I want to have Alex interview me on the topic and possibly, add a piece of the mystery of 9/11 from like the more metaphysical side. Because what you might not know from the title Time in the Technosphere is Jose Arguelles is basing a lot of his theories in this book around 9/11 being a time when our universe, or the biosphere, the mental sphere, however you want to label it, there was an energy buildup that eventually led to this moment that was 9/11. And his theory is that the energy that was built up to that point through the industrialization of our society, this stress, this disconnection from the Earth's natural harmony, this is where, the source of that tension, and it just kept building and building and building and culminated to that point in September 11th, 2001. And he has a lot of theories on why it was that date, and the numbers are very complicated, so we won't go too far into that because I myself don't have all that remembered. But the larger point that was gathered was that we as human beings right now at this point in time, and he wrote the book I think in 2003, so it's almost 15 or almost 20 years really from when he wrote it. He was saying that we have this opportunity to get back into the 13 moon cycle, back onto that Baktun calendar that the Mayans had, which is the actual harmonic rhythm of our, seasons. Really, it should be 13 moons, and that's a year. So the fact is, with this Gregorian calendar and then the subsequent calendars that came after that and before that, they have thrown us off of our connection with that natural rhythm. So part of learning and understanding the 13 moons is just trying to honor them and get into that practice of like, okay, the full moon's coming up, and at first we tried to rename every day of the week, and that became kind of tedious, but that's part of the playing around with these ideas and experimenting with them. So at this point, we've sort of resolved to like, well, we need to have our own house. And once we have that, then that will start the foundation through which this routine of really living in sync with the harmony of the 13 moons. You have to be able to really have domain over your sacred space, and where you live is sacred space, but it's hard to do that when you got, other people's energies and all that. So my lady and I were able to work together on this stuff, and she might jump in at some point here. But, the larger point is it really, all it takes is a choice, to go into this 13 moon cycle, having awareness of it and saying, okay, well, the full moon is here, the new moon is here, and I'm going to try to organize my days based on what the energy of that moon, full or new, where it is, whatever constellation is behind it, that has some information as to what's really going on in the spheres, or the flat plane, as I just had the David Weiss discussion, but whichever way you talk, or see the world, it's all affected, in a microcosm, macrocosm way. So by just observing these heavenly bodies, or lunar body, or what, if it's a hologram, or it doesn't matter if it's made out of cheese or whatever, it has a place in the rhythm of our environment. And I think getting back into tune with that is the goal of understanding the 13 moon cycle. Now, whether you choose to go and name the months differently, that's something that he advocates for, and really create like a personal connection with your perspective of time. Because if you're calling everything by October or January or whatever it is, that's going to take you out of this birthright that we all have, which is participating in the natural rhythm.
Beautifully said, man. Yeah. It's, as always, like I like to say on the podcast, it's the mimicry laid out upon what's natural and true and transformative and helpful to us. There's always that mimicry that's laid out. And this seems to be in the form of messing with our dates. And I actually heard from a guest, Ari told me that there's parts of the world that still operate under those 13 moon cycles. And they're not talked to, parts of the Middle East and Iran still operate under that. And of course that's suppressed. And, we're talking about one of the most suppressed areas of the world right there, somewhere where we would never take seriously, even if we may be found out on a mass scale that, oh, they're following this cycle, then we'd probably just dismiss it on a mass general scale. But maybe that's changing for the better over time now, this recognition of the ancient ways. I mean, that's kind of what I've seen over like a decade now. It seems like from Graham Hancock to Randall Carlson, all over the board, we have these, the shit's getting older. Everything keeps getting older and older and older. And it's all going back to these natural traditions and more, following nature and almost copying nature and honoring it in that way. Do you think that Tartaria kind of throws a wrench in all the progress we've kind of seen from that very ancient world, or do you think it can coexist kind of well together? I wanted your perspective on that, because I know you've kind of dabbled in the same areas,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's certainly fascinating. At first, the first time I ever heard anything about Tartaria, it was Max Egan on the Higher Side Chats, and I think even he mentioned something about it when he was on Tinfoil, but they focused more on like the fact that he was in Australia. And I wasn't working for Sam at this point in time. I was just delivering bread and delivering packages and doing my thing at the farmer's market. And a friend of mine who I, was training to take over for some of the days of the bakery route, he's like, yeah, what do you do while you're, driving? Because it's like 4 a.m. I'm training him how to do this job. So I'm like, dude, I just listen to podcasts while I'm working. So, I don't know if you're interested in this, but honestly, like, this is how I get through my day. So, and he's like, oh, actually, I love podcasts. I'm like, really? Oh, okay, cool. This is what I listen to. And he's like, I'm like, telling him about Tinfoil Hat. And he's like, well, have you ever heard of Tartaria? And I'm like, yeah, actually, I just heard about it like 2 weeks ago, and he starts getting in on Tartaria and telling me all this stuff about Tartaria, and we become friends and hung out several times since, and now he lives pretty far away, so we don't hang out much anymore, but it was a sort of synchronistic moment, and he actually is like an artist and makes murals that look like Tartarian buildings, and he happened to be a guest on my show that I did with Andreas, so all this information is really new to me. And the reason I go about and say that is because Jose Arguelles, in his book Time in the Technosphere, talks about how synchronicity and the art of time, or the law of art in time, is this sort of idea that these patterns that are emerging are never random. There's nothing random. And we're living in a time right now where consciousness is accelerated. And I think people are like, what do you mean accelerated? Well, your ability to engage with your surroundings is all dependent on vibration, right? You have your five senses that tap into a certain vibration, but you have higher senses than those five senses that can tap into even higher vibrations. And after that 9/11 event, and maybe even the 2012 event, which was supposedly the end of the world, right? But really that word apocalypse that they use just means great change or revelation, something to that degree. And it's like, yeah, pretty obvious to me that there's a synchronization going on. And if that means taking a different look at history, it would make a lot of sense, because the people who write the history books are the victors, and the victors are in control of this top-down pyramid scheme, right? So what do they rely on? They rely on guns, oil, drugs, sex, right? Controlling the sexes, controlling the family, manipulating that. Square one, boom. Drugs, putting drugs right in your veins as soon as you're born, recommending all these shots, and then putting aspirin and all these other benign drugs in your body, and then even in the ingredients with food and everything. Right? Drugs, right? Oil, I mean, pretty obvious what that affects: your home, your car, everything in between that needs to run a motor. And then guns, I mean, Second Amendment of this country, but also the reason why we're in every other country is with a gun in our hand. So it's very clear that that is the second tier of control. To me, I would say that top tier is this knowledgeable elite, and oil, energy, right? It has to be monopolized. That's the only way that they can exist. So of course they don't want us to understand how Tesla built what he built. And they don't want us to understand that Tesla came from a civilization of people that were way more informed than just him, and the creations that they were able to put together, combined with many different brilliant people like Tesla, is massive and impossible to completely erase from history. So they've had to do a lot, like World War II, the Soviet Union, all of these, the Chinese Communist Republic. I mean, the word Manchurian, has a curious history. So, people need to understand that the nations that we see today are not like the United States, where it's like, oh yeah, born in 1776, and this is it, and this is the amount of presidents we've had, and there's a lot shadier and murkier things going on. The more countries you add to the picture and how countries change. I mean, just look at Africa and what they did to the countries that were already there. They had kingdoms of people, they had sovereign people, they had people in democracies, they had people, governing themselves, and then they come and they enslave them, they kill them, and they rename plots of their land, Chad and Rhodesia, like all of these like European names for African places. The history books show the same plays over and over and over. And to me, I don't know really any conclusions when it comes to Tartaria, but I like the fact that there's so many open-ended questions going on right now, and people looking at buildings with a new set of lenses and saying, oh, okay, well, maybe this building was dug out because there was a mud flood, whether there's geological evidence for that, I don't know, a guy like Randall Carlson would probably have more information on that than anyone else, but there's probably other guys out there who are inspired and are going to come up and bring some new evidence to the surface. But we can see that evidence isn't going to come from a place like the Smithsonian Institute, which, by the way, sponsors the History Channel, which plays Ancient Aliens over and over and over again, and they want you to believe in aliens, that aliens built the pyramids and aliens built all these structures. Why do they want us to go with that narrative? Why is that narrative all over the television? Not because aliens exist or not, that's not the point I'm making, but the point is the same thing that the flat earthers always say, is like, oh, they want us to think that we're meaningless in this meaningless universe on a meaningless ball. It's like, okay, well, we can still have a meaningful existence, but that doesn't mean the earth is flat. We kind of started this conversation talking about that because I just got off of a conversation with David, but still, either way, nothing against him. I actually really enjoyed talking to him, or listening to him rather. But back to my point, it's like we're living in a perspective-based world that is constantly faced with interference. And,
absolutely.
When you can drop that history that you were given in school and really look at something for what it is and say, okay, well, if this stone is this big, how did they build it? Well, David Weiss, he was just telling me that according to him, this is an electric universe, and if that's the case, if you can give something a positive charge, it will supposedly weigh less, right? So there is science in that realm. And if we're living in this Tartarian universe where certain structures have the ability to channel electricity from the atmosphere and use that to power buildings, I mean, now we're talking a whole new paradigm where humans could have built the pyramids. Humans could have used a whole set of skills and technology based on a basis of knowledge that is lost today, because right now it's pretty much, believe us or you're screwed, believe us or face the gallows, believe us or get burned at the stake, believe us or be shunned, believe us or have a bad social credit score. And the scientists are the ones saying, believe all science. I mean, that's on people's lawn signs in some, counties.
It's ludicrous. It's so anti-science.
Yeah. And I think the most scientific signs are in the conservative areas where it's saying unmask our kids, because all the science shows that wearing a mask on your face is incredibly unhealthy. It raises the temperature of your mouth, which causes the bacteria that are supposed to be there to die, making your immune system weaker because the microbiome in your body has less tools to use to fight off negative bacteria that might make its way in there, in this natural give and take and ebb and flow as everything else is in life. You look around you at nature and things are constantly fighting and eating each other, but that doesn't mean that like fighting and killing is the way it is either. It's just a part of life. It's just one dimension of life. And so is sickness. But that, doesn't mean just because lions kill zebra that you're going to walk in the woods and see a lion. Same thing goes with this whole COVID thing. It's like we need our immune systems stronger and stronger, and part of that strength comes from having mental fortitude. And that's exactly what they're trying to take from us by constantly pushing this fear, fear on us. And fear is powerful. I mean, yesterday I was walking in a state park in Connecticut, and, sometimes I think I'm not afraid of snakes, but I'm also like worried that I might step on one, just because it make sense. If you're going off trail, chances are you might step on a snake potentially. Who knows, right? So that's my thought. And it might be silly because my girlfriend, she's like, got shorts on, like bare legs, frolicking through the woods, and I got long pants on. So I was probably even more protected than her. But I'm
She's
worried
using
about
that. She's using that law of assumptions. I'm not gonna get bit. I'm one
yeah.
with these creatures. I'm good.
Well, but I'll tell you what, I was using that same thing as we
Yeah.
all are, and less than 5 minutes into like going off the trail and just kind of following whatever path we followed, we come onto another trail, and sitting right on the trail is a massive water moccasin, like full too. Like he had just eaten like a rat and a frog and like whatever else. So he was just chilling, didn't seem like he was in the mood to mess with us, but we had to walk by him like within a foot of him just to cross the trail. So it was a moment that we shared that was a little exciting and definitely, one of those
awesome.
like animal omens that you can actually manifest. But I think I manifested it just through worrying. And maybe that was a lesson for me in that moment is, worry less, because look at the snake. He's full. He's happy. He's no threat to you, but you did manifest it.
Yeah. It's almost like, if you're nice to the universe, even when you do worry and you let those invading thoughts kind of get you, you can manifest stuff, but it's almost like the universe being like, hey, listen, we're buddies. All right. I'm not gonna attack you, but I'm here. So watch those thoughts. All right. Because it really does happen that way. I mean, my wife and I kind of point that out to each other quite often too. Like, hey, weren't you thinking about that all day yesterday? And look at what just happened. It always
and that's
happens.
like the point. And I'm sure you notice it with your wife, is like when you do have, the opportunity to share this with a partner, it makes it all that much better, because you compound, not only do you compound like the mental energy, the spiritual energy, but you have a witness, someone who
Yes.
understands and can be like, wow, okay, I see the meaning there too. And that's what this is all about. We talked about I mentioned the scene, the synchromistic exploration of the ever expanding now, but that all came from Tara and I going on a journey up the Connecticut River and listening to Michael Sandler talk. And he mentioned signs, symbols, and synchronicities. And then he said something about story and how we're all living the story of our life. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's like the three little S's and the larger S, like signs, symbols, and synchronicities are the little S's that make up our story. But then, our stories make up this larger S that is the collective story. And I think what's so cool about knowing guys like yourself and Ron from New England and Michael Wan is like, we're all taking these different angles and looking into these things from different angles. And we all come from different walks of life, and we can all unfold this map and put together this puzzle together from those different corners, instead of one person just trying to, it's like unfolding a huge tent, but you only have one person. Like you have to go to each corner and pull it out. It's a lot easier when you have four people on each side to just kind of pull it out. So that's what I see happening here, is the more people that listen to shows like this, the more eyes we have on this mystery, and the more manifestations or omens can come to the surface, the more synchronicities can come to the surface, and we'll start to find things.
Yeah. I was thinking the other day about how I wonder if a podcast itself, not even necessarily a logo, but the idea of like, everyone should have a podcast that's being pushed everywhere. Like everybody get on this, everybody just share your thoughts, get it out there. I wonder if these podcasts are in a way, a kind of intention, like a sigil of some kind in their own right. You know what I mean? I mean, I put this up here intentionally, I wanted this logo right here. Cause I don't necessarily dabble with a lot of that stuff, but I'm fascinated by it. I've been fascinated by it ever since I learned about Grant Morrison and the Invisibles. And, that's basically the comic series, the graphic novel series that inspired the Matrix, And so it's cool to have like this idea that we are co-writing this collective story. I mean, the whole time you were giving that description, I was like seeing sacred geometry symbols like in my head, like, and like fractal almost, because that's kind of what you're talking about. We have our own little world, our own little universes. It's as above, so below. And are you into like the idea of like holographic universe as well by any chance, like David Talbot's work? Because
Yeah.
I'm thinking like it all kind of fits together, it seems. I feel like there's multiple new approaches to like physics or the universe, like electric universe theory and the holographic theory. They work well together, you know, they don't necessarily contradict one another. So it seems like we are kind of getting closer and closer to getting that tent set up. You know what I mean? The tent is almost there. Then we got to set up the air mattress. And then there's just there's so many layers to this, you know? And as you said, unfolding, right? It's like that Eastern idea of the lotus flower. Let me ask you if you feel this way. As I research all these different lines of thinking, it never seems to end. There's always another corner to turn. You know what I mean? There's never necessarily, we never get the thing, you know, we're always chasing it around the next corner, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm too new into this or middle of the way to notice that yet. But I think it's important to define your goals, you know, and whether
True.
that means, you know, knowing as much as you can about alchemy or metaphysics or the occult. And I think when it comes to the occult type stuff, you know, you find that a lot of this information comes from people like Crowley, who were just experimenting with this stuff themselves. You know, they'd find an old book, they'd find these old practices, you know, in these clubs where this information is circulated, you know, secret societies and whatnot. And it was all a matter of experimentation. And I think that's where we are right now. Like you mentioned, everybody's going to have a podcast, but it is intention setting, you know, especially when you consider that if you speak about something and it goes out to as many people as it does for some podcasts, that's your intention multiplied by however many people listen to it with a positive attitude or mindset at the very least.
Yeah.
Somebody who listens with a negative mindset, I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I haven't done like a double blind study. But I think there is, like with what Lynn McTaggart talked about when she was on the Higher Side Chats and the power of 8, you know, you have this threshold, where people are able to combine their mental energies or spiritual energies towards one intention. So that's why, like on my show, I've been telling people a little bit about where my girlfriend are at right now with this bus, because I'm like, you know, people at least will hear that we're looking for a bus and put some intention into that, positive intention, and maybe even be so kind to throw us some money, because that's not cheap. But we did find a bus after talking about it. I don't know if it's the right one yet. I still haven't test drove it yet. But yeah, the goal is to hit the road and be mobile in a conversion camper van. And a bus might be better because I'm tall, so I need the headroom. But yeah, we'll see. But that's the thing, man. It's like once you get out on the road, there's so much randomness that occurs that I think you really start to accelerate your capacity for synchronicity. It's like that journey I went on that I was beginning to tell you about. We were on our way to the Porcupine Festival in Lancaster, New Hampshire. And, you know, we're like an hour away or so. And we just set the intention to see an animal omen. And less than 10 minutes later, we see something crossing the road, maybe like 100 feet away, not too far away. We're getting closer and closer, and it's a porcupine making its way across the road. And we're like, what the hell? We manifested a porcupine on our way to Porcupine Fest. And then naturally, you know, when you're up in those parts, you see these signs on the side of the road warning you about moose, because even though it's not common to see these moose, when you do, you got to be careful because they'll be in the road and they sometimes get stubborn and could cause your car some problems. So we see all these signs for moose and we're like, all right, let's manifest a moose. Not only did we see one moose, we saw 2 moose standing on the side of the road waiting to cross, and that was within 10 minutes of the porcupine. Now, this was at sunset, which is the most active time for animals. You know, if we had done these manifestations in the high noon, it might not have been as easy, but we didn't think about that like 3 days before. We just spur of the moment. We're like, hey, let's set an intention here. And, you know, rightfully so, is at that perfect time of the day when you can see some animals that otherwise are not really active. We're in a place where there was less conscious energy in the air. You know, I think when you're in a city, you're competing with all these other energy centers, you know, and it's almost why you feel so much more exhausted taking a 20 minute walk through a city than you would taking a 20-minute walk through a forest. You know, obviously the oxygen quality has something to do with that, and maybe the hard cement as well. But either way, you get my point. There's almost like a zapping effect, and some people tune into that. Some people love the energy of a city. Personally, I love the energy of like a mountain, river, forests, or anything in between.
I'm right there with you, brother. I'm taking a trip to the mountains tomorrow night, actually. I'm actually thinking about doing like a little live thing from the summit if I can, if I have service. But, you know, that's kind of one of the great points about going to the places like that is most of the time, even if you have the desire, the phone's almost useless up in those areas. So it kind of helps you like, no, put it down. It's okay. Just take it all in and relax.
You know what? I agree with you 100%. I just had Tony Merkel from the Confessionals podcast on my show, and he mentioned how he was going out and he was looking to record this. I think it was like a haunted World War II prisoner of war site, and he hears a Bigfoot scream for the first time ever. Like he, you know, loves the subject, obviously huge paranormal podcast, but I think this is one of the few encounters or weird experiences he's ever had. Maybe we didn't get into all of them, or maybe I just don't remember. People can go listen to that show. But either way, he mentioned hearing the Sasquatch scream. And when he went to look at his equipment, he noticed that his microphone cord had broke. And my theory that I posited during the conversation in the moment was like, well, do you think that possibly the fact that your microphone equipment broke, that gave way on an energetic level for that experience to happen? Because you hear that often with these cases where people like have something happen and they find out there's an equipment malfunction. We were just talking with David Weiss about how we're living this electric world. Everything's electricity. You and I just talked about that with Tartaria. I firmly believe that. I mean, this lamp next to me shocked me the other day, and I felt the electricity. You know, it didn't feel good, but that's like, you know, proper current, proper voltage and all that. I'm not the right, you know, capacitor for that amount of voltage, so it hurt. But either way, that's like what we're living in, and I think Sasquatch is tuned into that even more. And when you have that equipment on you or a phone, it almost gives them the signal that you are not someone to be interacted with. You know, because their whole motive is to be, you know, stealth or unseen. You know, they're not particularly happy with human beings. I had a guy named Seb who was just on my show. Again, also unreleased episode, but it might be out by the time this is out. And Seb said he had an astral connection with the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot said, you know, we're not happy with humanity, you know, and take that for what it is. And folks can listen to his story for what it is. But that makes a lot of sense to me, you know, that these beings are living in a sort of higher vibrational state than what we normally typically interact with on a day-to-day basis. But when we go out into these wild spaces, the energy kind of pulls us in because things are vibrating higher up there. When we tune into that, maybe those electronic devices, they get, you know, affected in a bad way by this high energy, or, you know, when they're around, it just kind of drags your energy down too. I mean, they do say it's like dirty electricity that we're dealing with here. Can't be great for our auras.
That's true. I mean, and if they are on a higher dimension, they're probably very aware of all, they're probably using their own frequencies to operate by, and coming into close quarters with those probably maybe not harmful, but disruptive and foreign frequencies from our technology. Yeah, I could see that definitely being something that they would push against and stay away from as much as possible. It's interesting. We've been going every which way in this conversation, and that's awesome. Like, we haven't really covered anything like I specifically set out to cover, and low key, that's always what my goal is, to just randomly let this fall out, because I think it's good to have us just flow like this, but I kind of
prefer
want
it. And I noticed it when we talked on the phone. I will say, it's like you asked about Alt Media United. The whole thing that's really started since I got into Alt Media United. At first, I was like, all right, I want to have people in the cooperative. So I got people that were kind of more established and didn't need my help for much,
right.
But they appreciated, and they appreciated the, another spot where their website, another website that had their podcast on it, at the very little.
So supportive,
And yeah, there's a lot of cool people that joined in at the early stages. But then as time goes on, I start meeting guys that are just getting off the ground, like myself, and yeah, I mean, some conversations are very businessy. Some conversations are more like ours, where we just kind of talk back and forth. And maybe that's the New England thing, though, bro. I mean, come on now. You're a New Hampshire guy. I'm a Connecticut guy.
I'm a
We're both on the
Massachusetts dude. I'm a Massachusetts guy. I'm a little even closer to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm right in the middle. But I am hoping to maybe become a New Hampshire guy. Having Etienne.
Ron confused me.
Oh, I've been telling him the same thing. I'm like, Ron, tell me about this area of New Hampshire. Tell me about this area, because my wife and I are trying to maybe get out of this area. We're very close to suburban, trafficy, loud, everything. You know what I mean?
But from Massachusetts, I mean, I don't know how close you are to Boston or Braintree, and that
40 minutes.
So you're familiar enough with that whole center of like intelligentsia type energy, and like,
oh yeah, walking through Boston, I feel so out of place, man, even though it's been my home city my whole life. I'm like you, I prefer a mountain.
Yeah, and here in Connecticut, I mean, we have Hartford and New Haven, both interesting places. New Haven, obviously Yale University. Hartford has some interesting schools as well, but there's a lot of energy that's really been coming up more and more with this whole COVID thing, the medical nonsense, which we don't need to get into all that, because I'm definitely not an expert. But I'll reserve to, what the women say, my body, my choice. That's at the end of the day, that's what I go with for that one. But
I've been kind of like making the establishment on my podcast that like I'll only talk about those things from an objective archetypal position. I no longer want to get into the nitty gritty of all the headlines that keep coming out and the new parts of this that are getting scarier or more threatening. I can deal with that off the air, because I don't want to give that out to my audience. I don't want to give that out to my guest.
And you mentioned that, and that's exactly what I just heard from someone who signed up for the Patreon today. They said, awesome. I love the positive vibe of your show. And I'm like, well, we don't talk about the news. We have guests on and we ask them how they got into this stuff, and then the ball rolls from there, And I think that's like that's a good format. I think there's other formats, but yeah, that's like another thing I do with Alt Media Unite is like figure out how the art of podcasting and how, someone starting can be successful, or how someone who's already been doing it for a while can be more successful. And, that connecting back to the other point that I wanted to make and maybe turn into a question for you is like,
sure.
Being in Connecticut, I've noticed like the Connecticut River obviously is a big part of the state, but there's so many things that were invented in Connecticut, from the first helicopter flight to the first submarine, the first newspaper, the first portable typewriter, the first cotton gin, the first lollipop, like just all over the map. Like the hamburgers, we apparently have the best pizza, so like looking into your own local area, you can find a lot of these little facts that, add up to something. Maybe not much at first. You might be like, what is this, like a roadside attraction type thing, like
Yeah, right.
what's the point? Like, it's nostalgic, cool, great. But what I'm starting to realize, thanks to my friend Michael Wan, is like, once you learn it about the mystery that there is behind the history of the place you were born, so many things start to get pieced together. Like, we were just in Old Saybrook, Connecticut yesterday, and I noticed there's an old map, and it said that the West Indies warehouse was in Old Saybrook. Now, you raised your eyebrows because you're like, West Indies? That sounds like Dutch East Indies.
Sure does.
And there was a Dutch West Indies company that was very similar to the Dutch East Indies company, and those companies were very much involved with the founding of Yale University. Skull and Bones is a part of Yale University. George W. Bush, his father, and his grandfather were all three members of Skull and Bones. So the symbolism, the significance, it's there. Now, how that even connects, right? There's a college in Yale called Saybrook College. And back in the day, before Yale University was created in New Haven, it was started in Branford, which is in between New Haven and Old Saybrook. And a lot of these names of places were not the same as they were, today. Like, people don't realize that sometimes a county becomes a town, or a town becomes a county, or a town gets renamed, or a borough becomes the whole town, So there's all these little things that happen in history that add up to a larger story. One piece of information, which, oh my God, if a listener could help me out with this would be amazing. But I thought there was an episode of the Higher Side Chats, which I lost track of, that talked about a Connecticut governor who was once an alchemist. And I'm like, wow. So there was a Connecticut governor who at some point in the 1800s was practicing alchemy, or maybe even further back. But, these are the little pieces of information that we can all like understand. And then that can create an experience like what happened to me yesterday. So we talked about the snake, right? Well, we saw that snake as we were adventuring around a place called Macomudis State Park. Now, Macomudis State Park is historically a word, Macomudis, an Indian word, Native American word, that means place of the angry god, or angry noise, something to do with loud, angry noise. And there's this whole history of this place, Moodus, Connecticut, that inspired the Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. For anybody who likes that guy, I don't know much about him.
I
but
have read that and many others by him.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's, one person. But then there was a guy named Dr. Steele who was allegedly called by King George to come investigate the area and figure out why these noises were happening. But even further back from that, the Indians, the Native Americans, they say that there's a man that lives under, their god, this god, not their god as in one god, but a god, who lives under these rocks in a cave on a sapphire throne. And he was very unhappy that the European god arrived on his lands. And that's why the noises started, right? So ever since then, there's been earthquakes and noises in this area, and people are like, must come up from underground, or must be an earthquake. It's very fascinating. And after we see the snake, we're just like walking around. We're kind of going down further, looking at the different rocks and admiring the different rocks. And my girlfriend, Tara, she goes, "Do you hear that?" And I listen, and all of a sudden I hear boom, 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 like a big, like thunder. But there's no clouds in the sky, no storms. It's been nice weather since that tropical storm Fred blew through here. But yeah, man, we heard the moodest noises, and it was just, the right place, the right time. and knowing that
wild.
history that put us in that spot and having that experience, you know.
Absolutely.
I can't say much more than that, other than it was definitely stunning in a way, and worthwhile, you know, definitely like tangible enough to be like, wow, okay, that wasn't a truck driving by, that wasn't a motorcycle, it definitely wasn't thunder, because that has its own ring. It was a clear rumbling, real rumbling, almost like rocks falling in a hollow place underneath the earth, you know. And you know, when we get back into the hollow earth stuff, it's like, yeah, I'm sure, especially on a place like a river, that there's some hollow caves or other special areas. Someone who's really significant to my journey and understanding all this stuff told me that in his culture, the Pueblo indigenous people in Arizona, all the way in Arizona, they talked about here, this land being sacred, being a Garden of Eden.
Whoa.
And
That's
if you
interesting.
talk about like the geological perspective, they say like, yeah, after a certain line, New England is all old, you know, type of architecture, or not architecture, sorry, forgive me. Tartarian people don't go crazy there. And they talk about how the geography and the geology and the flora and the fauna are very similar to what was in North Africa, because this part of this land was in, you know, if you believe in the whole Pangea thing, a part of that whole connection, you know, where you can kind of see how South America looks like it once fit on Africa. Well, the tip of Florida all the way up to where Long Island, Connecticut is, would have been on that part of Africa that is Morocco and Mauritania and all those other countries along that western coast of Africa there, Saharan coast, you know. And to me, you know, very interesting, you know, especially if we look at like the Mayan and Aztec connections with hieroglyphics in the Susquehanna River Valley, something that Michael Wan and I have been talking about. So you have all these really strange connections. You have the land that's much older on this side of the Appalachian Mountains. And you have, you know, all these people talking about Tartarian research. You know, I think this is just the beginning, you know. We have so much to unfold, and it starts with like looking in your own backyard, because one person can't do it themselves. And I think, you know, where you're born is significant. So why not start with your backyard? You know, we'll all figure it out together.
Yeah, I could definitely tell you a story about Massachusetts.
Let's hear
that I've definitely put intention into in the past. But before I forget, let me try to share this screen. Yeah, right here. You seeing that?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are maps of the cave systems in the United States. When you said that those people out in Arizona felt something connected to Connecticut and this region on like a spiritual level, it immediately made me think of all the cave systems that connect basically all these areas underground. And this is a total tangent, but I just thought it was interesting to bring up that these massive mammoth cave systems in the east here, they don't just stop in the east. The name stops, but these little caverns are everywhere. I wouldn't doubt that there's people that possibly made these great travels, perhaps maybe these great pilgrimages from one side to another. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think of that? That's pretty wild, right?
Yeah, well, they definitely talk about, you know, certain cultures saying that they had to go underground to escape this cataclysm.
Yeah.
And it's totally, yeah, that's within the same southwestern cultures that talk about, you know, what I just described as sacred green space on the East Coast that they called like what, you know, Christians call the Garden of Eden. Because there's this big, you know, confluence, this mixing of indigenous culture and Christianity, tragically so. But yeah, that's part of it. And I mean, personally, it scares me, the idea of traveling that many miles through a cave. So,
And
I
I would
mean,
love
unless,
to love that. I want to love that. Like I climb mountains. I love
right
that. Why can't I do the other way? I was talking to my friends about it. All of us were like,
now, but
no.
what if there's like something down there that glows like you see in the underground parts of the, or the really deep parts of the ocean,
Mhm.
or something like Tesla tech, Tartaria tech that just lit the whole place up when things weren't in a cataclysmic or closed off state that people say we're in now. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be, if I wouldn't want to go through there a dark cave, but if it was, somewhat like anciently created in a way that was, for people to travel through, that's a
Right.
different story. I
Like
definitely
Egypt.
think, well, and then Ari, to bring him back up again, he was showing me on the latest appearance on My Family Thinks I'm Crazy with him, the electric nature of these canyons and how it looks like
Yeah.
lightning scars, and
It's unbelievable. He was trying to like prove the rivers crossing in the wrong direction. And if he could
mm,
do that, he was that doesn't add up.
right, yeah, it's definitely, just to the eye, it looks very similar to the way lightning branches, but all things kind of live in this microcosmic, macrocosmic pattern way.
Fractal. Mhm.
Yeah, fractal kind of way, but you know that, and with that in mind, maybe there was a cataclysm that, yeah, pushed people underground and caused them to come from where Atlantis used to be, kind of over here on the East Coast, and move down, to the coast down there near Mexico, because it's pretty, San Diego seems to be pretty great, according to what I hear. I don't know if it's like green or whatnot, but it can't be
Mm.
like Palm Springs. There's
No.
all these like places in the Southwest that you can find, like little oases. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, it's definitely, that's part of the mystery, just too far from me. I mean, Carlos Castaneda's books were a big inspiration for me, so
Yeah,
I've
me
always
too.
liked the, you know imagery of the desert, hence my logo, with the pyramids on the back
Hmm.
here. But yeah, that's like,
Yeah, that's
it
awesome, man.
it's
I love that.
something mystical when you go through and figure out the energy behind the place. And like I was saying, where you're born is so important to who you are. So
That's
why
right.
not start there?
Yeah, that's right. So I'll tell you this little story. We have a place in central Massachusetts that is pretty infamous called Spider Gates, and it's in the northern part of Worcester, but it's like the only solid section of Worcester that's all woods, very, very deep old woods, and it leads into Leicester and all these other areas of Massachusetts. And I believe a child or a very young teenager hanged himself back in the 80s. And so it probably left you know, probably an energetic scar there, if anything. But back then, when I was a teenager and Spider Gates was the creepy place to go, and the cops will get you. So, you had to organize like a SWAT team. You're getting dropped off here and you're going to get picked up here. And none of us had cell phones. So, so the thing is, when we went there and we would sneak in there and stuff, I only went there a couple of times as a younger person, but we literally, I mean, looking back, completely created basically a psychosis amongst ourselves and terrorized each other completely on accident because we just brought that energy in. The first time we went in there, it was the place that all the older kids had talked about, you know? And so we were like, oh my God, we're really doing it, man. That kind of feeling when you're younger and you're actually doing something completely crazy and you're like, wow, the
Mm.
adrenaline's pumping. You're an idiot. You're young. So we just completely freaked out. We ended up running out of there after my friend got wind of us being terrified, and he always likes to play almost like the trickster god in every situation. So he ended up kind of disappearing for a few minutes and suddenly showing up next to us, all hooded up, and literally just gave us that one last jolt to send us over the edge, and we all just ran screaming out of the Worcester woods. And it's just funny to think back on it like that, because now I understand what was happening, because in the time we were all completely terrified. We didn't know if we were going to run into Satanists, or the rumors were insane about that place. So we just were jacked up on the myth, the mythologos, whatever you want to say, about the place that we were in. I can see that now, and it's pretty wild. But looking back at that place in general now with a more broad perspective and going back there, it's an absolutely beautiful little haven in the middle of nowhere, and the sounds of a big city that surround that area have no impact whatsoever on that thick woods. And you're looking at stones with writing on them from the 1600s from your area. It was really pretty amazing to think of it that way instead after all those years.
Yeah, and I think that intention definitely plays a big part, like we were saying before with the Sasquatch kind of stuff. Like when you go out into these places, your consciousness is the only thing there sometimes, as far as human consciousness goes. So you get, I think, more feedback from